The sale went through on a Thursday morning in April of 1984, and Ruth Ann Decker sat alone on a wooden bench in the hallway of the Miller County Courthouse. Her hands folded across the top of her purse, her back straight, the way her mother had taught her to sit in rooms where people were watching and waiting for you to look small. She was 73 years old. She had driven herself the 12 miles from her farm on County Road 7 in her 1971 Ford pickup, the one her husband Harold had bought secondhand the year before his heart gave out, the one she had kept running, because Harold taught her how, and because she had learned long ago that a woman farming alone could not afford to need things she did not know how to fix herself. The courthouse smelled of floor wax and damp wool, and the particular staleness of a room that processed other people's business all day long. The clock above the recorder's desk ticked with the indifferent steadiness of a machine that had no opinion about what happened beneath it. Men in clean hats moved through the hall with the easy confidence of people who had been inside this building many times and found it unremarkable. Ruth Ann watched them. The Harrow place was 640 acres. River bottom soil on the low-end rolling pasture above it, timber along the east bank of the Osage River. It had belonged to the Harrow family for 80 years until the last one died in a rest home in Rolla, and the distant relatives in St. Louis decided without particular sadness that land and taxes and flood insurance were not worth keeping if you had never stood barefoot in the mud of it. The auction had drawn half the county. Men with clean boots and polished opinions stood on the courthouse steps talking about yields and drainage costs and whether the river ground was worth the risk. The winning bid was $1.27 million. The man who placed it was named Grant Bellamy. He was 48 years old, broad at the shoulders, silver beginning to show at his temples, with a face that photographed well, and a voice trained by years of rooms where other men listened. He owned Bellamy Grain and Storage, 3 grain elevators running between Eldon and Versailles, a feed warehouse near the highway, a cold storage facility leased to a meat processor in Sedalia. He arrived at the courthouse in a black Lincoln Town car with 2 white company trucks behind it, and when he shook hands with the recorder and signed the deed, he did it the way men sign things they have been planning for a long time, without hesitation, without ceremony, with the quiet assurance of someone who considers the outcome already settled. Ruth Ann was not in that room. She was in the hallway. But she had heard every word through the open door because she had positioned herself to hear, and because in 73 years of living in Miller County, she had learned that the information most important to her was almost never delivered to her directly. When Grant Bellamy walked out of the recorder's office with his lawyer and his field manager, and the banker named Lyle Keller from First Western Agricultural, Ruth Ann stood up from the wooden bench. He noticed her the way men notice a woman they have already sorted. Pleasant enough, unremarkable. Someone from the neighborhood. She said his name. He turned. She told him who she was. Ruth Ann Decker. Her farm shared his north fence line for nearly 3/4 of a mile. She had been his neighbor before he knew she existed. He extended his hand. She shook it once briefly, the way you shake the hand of someone you are not trying to impress. Then she said what she had driven 12 miles to say. There was a hedge on the north edge of his new property. Osage orange cedar, wild plum, old wire swallowed by bark over 60 years of growth. It ran above the old creek scar. She asked him not to cut it, and there was a low depression behind it. People in the county called it the Dead Creek. It was not dead. She asked him not to fill it. Grant Bellamy listened with the patience of a man who had already made his plans and was now performing the courtesy of hearing someone else describe their concerns before proceeding. Then he told her he had engineers coming from Columbia, drainage consultants from Jefferson City, a soil analysis already scheduled. He told her very kindly that whatever the land needed done, qualified people would find it. She said the engineers would not tell him what she was telling him. He asked what she was telling him. She said that ground has a memory. The hedge and the creek are part of how it keeps that memory. If you remove them, the land will not forget what they were. It will only lose the ability to manage what it knows. The lawyer looked at the ceiling. Grant smiled. It was the practiced smile, the patient one, the one that men use in rooms like this when they want the witnesses present to understand that they are being reasonable in the face of something unreasonable. He told her he did not pay $1.27 million to farm around stories. He said it gently. That was what she remembered later. Not the dismissal which she had expected. The gentleness. The tone men use when they believe they are being kind to someone who cannot understand what they understand. She said all right. She walked back to the tax window, paid her property assessment, renewed her grazing permit, and drove home. In the hallway behind her, she heard the lawyer say something low, and then the soft sound of a group of men allowing themselves a private moment of amusement at something they did not have to say out loud. Ruth Ann Decker had been hearing that sound for most of her life. She did not turn around. The Decker farm sat on 118 acres of Miller County land that had been in her family since 1869. Not inherited, purchased. Her grandfather, Thomas Decker, born into slavery in 1842, had worked for wages from the moment freedom came and spent every dollar that was not needed for food and survival on that land. He had bought the first 40 acres with mule money and timber money and his wife Clara's egg savings. He had added to it twice more before he died in 1931 at the age of 89, having never once borrowed against the title. The house was white clapboard gray now with age, with a tin roof that Harold had patched and repatched over the years, and that Ruth Ann had patched again after him. The barn leaned slightly east. The walnut tree in the side yard had been planted by Thomas himself, which meant it was over 100 years old and had the slow, certain presence of something that had outlived most arguments. Ruth Ann had been born in that house. She had married Harold Decker in the front yard of it because the church was too small and because it was June and the yard was beautiful. She had buried Harold from that same yard 5 years ago, standing in the same spot under the walnut tree, where they had stood as young people watching the casket go into the ground of a place that had always been more than a farm to this family. It was evidence that they had been here, that they had worked this particular soil and learned this particular land and survived this particular county across 5 generations. In a place where that evidence had once been threatened and sometimes forcibly erased, the Decker farm stood as the kind of proof that does not require an argument. You could see it from the road. Ruth Ann parked the Ford behind the house and sat for a moment with both hands still on the wheel. Through the truck window, she could see the north fence line, and beyond it, visible even from this distance, as a dark, ragged strip against the pale April sky, the hedge. Osage orange, mostly thorned and dense with cedar, and wild plum grown into it over decades until the whole line was a single tangled organism. Ugly in winter, impenetrable in summer, and absolutely irreplaceable in ways that no aerial photograph or soil test had the vocabulary to measure. Thomas Decker had planted the first section of that hedge in 1878. He had not planted it for aesthetics. He had not planted it because a government pamphlet told him to. He had planted it because in the spring of 1877, the field on the Harrow side of the line had flooded in a pattern that alarmed him. He had watched where the water came from and where it wanted to go, and where it pooled when it could not. And he had planted the hedge because he understood, without being told by anyone with a degree, that the land was using that strip of thorn and root to hold a pressure it had been managing for centuries. His son Abraham had maintained it. Harold had maintained it. Ruth Ann had maintained it. Now Grant Bellamy's engineers were coming from Columbia. She went inside, hung her coat on the nail beside the door, washed her hands at the kitchen sink, and stood at the window for a long time, looking at the Harrow land. Then she opened the drawer beneath the flour bin and took out the notebook. It was wrapped in oilcloth. The cover was brown leather, cracked at the corners, swollen slightly from over a century of Missouri weather and kitchen air. Thomas Decker had written his name inside it in the careful, deliberate hand of a man who had taught himself to read and write as an adult and treated the ability as the serious tool it was. The notebook contained 60 years of entries, rain records, flood marks, hand-drawn maps of water movement, notes on where clay appeared after rain, where cattle refused to stand, where ground went hollow underfoot in warm weather. Notes on what he had planted and why, what he had built, and where what he had warned his children about, and what he had found his own father's observations to be true in season after season after season. On June 3, 1927, Thomas had written River rose after warm rain. Harrow North Field took water from below before the ditch filled. The hedge held. The Harrow Field did not. Blue clay opened near Old Mule Crossing. Water will always find the road it knew before men covered it. Do not cut the hedge. Do not fill the old creek. Water remembers its road even when men forget it. Ruth Ann read it the way she read it every year. Then she opened her own tablet and wrote the date and what had happened at the courthouse. April 12, 1984. Bellamy bought the Harrow place. Plans to cut North Hedge and fill the dead creek. Warned him at the courthouse. He smiled and did not listen. She paused, then added one more line, same as always. She did not mean it bitterly. She meant it accurately. In her 73 years, she had watched this particular exchange happen so many times and in so many forms that it had stopped making her angry and started making her careful. Careful the way a person gets careful about weather, about health, about the slow approach of things that cannot be stopped but can sometimes be managed if you do not waste energy being surprised. She closed the tablet and put the kettle on. Outside, the spring afternoon was cooling toward evening. A mockingbird was working through its entire catalog in the walnut tree. The lower pasture was green and slightly damp, the way it always was in April, and 3 of her cattle stood near the south gate in the easy patience of animals that had nowhere to be. She had 14 head, mixed cattle the way Harold had always kept them. She had been thinking about reducing the herd since Harold died, not because she could not manage them, but because 14 head required more fence work than she preferred to do alone in winter. But the cattle were part of the operation, and the operation was what kept the farm a farm, rather than just a piece of land an old woman lived on, and Ruth Ann Decker had not driven 12 miles to the courthouse and back to let the farm become just a piece of land with a house on it. She poured her tea and sat at the kitchen table with Thomas's notebook open beside her cup, not reading it exactly, just keeping it company, the way you keep company with something that has been important for a very long time. The next morning she woke before the radio clicked on. She dressed in the dark, stepped outside onto the back porch, and heard it immediately. Diesel. Not close yet. Down the road somewhere near the Harrow entrance. The particular low rumble of heavy equipment idling before work begins the kind of sound that settles into the ground before it reaches your ears. She went to the north fence before breakfast. By the time she got there, 3 trucks were parked along the Harrow fence line. Grant Bellamy stood with a man in a white hard hat pointing across the field. A yellow bulldozer sat on the low rise with its blade already lifted, exhaust drifting in the cold morning air. Wooden stakes with orange ribbon had been driven in a line along the hedge, marking it for removal, the way you mark something for removal when you have already decided and just need the crew to know where to start. Ruth Ann stopped at her side of the wire. Grant saw her and walked over. His expression was businesslike now, without the courthouse courtesy. He said, "Morning, Mrs. Decker." She said, "Morning." She had brought Thomas's notebook open to the 1927 page. She held it over the top fence wire so he could see it without her crossing onto his property. She said, "Before you start, you should see this." He looked at it the way you look at something you have already decided not to read. 2 seconds. Then he looked back at her face. She explained the page. The flood pattern from 1927. The spring pocket below the old mule crossing. The blue clay seam that Thomas had found running northeast from the creek scar toward the stone run that crossed her own lower pasture. She explained that the hedge was not brush. It was a pressure management system that her grandfather had built and that the land had incorporated over 100 years, and that removing it would not make the field work better. It would make the field unstable in ways that would not show up until the first serious rain. Grant listened. Then he told her they had aerial surveys, soil tests, a drainage tile plan engineered by licensed professionals from Colombia. She said aerials show what water is doing on the surface. They do not show what the clay is doing at depth. He said, "We have soil tests." She said, "Not deep enough." He said, "Ruth Ann, I appreciate your concern. I truly do." His voice had dropped into that register again, the patient one, the one meant to close a conversation rather than continue it. "But I have a banknote tied to a planting schedule. I have seed ordered. I have 2 center pivots financed and a machinery shed going up before the end of the month. What I cannot do is reorganize a $1 million development plan around a 1927 pencil entry in an old notebook." She said, "I understand that." He said, "Good." She said, "I did not say I agreed. I said I understand." He looked at her with something that was not quite irritation and not quite respect, a middle expression that men sometimes arrive at when a woman refuses to be moved by the tools that usually move people. Then he turned to the bulldozer operator and lifted one hand. The blade dropped. The first Osage orange came down with a sound like a rifle shot. Dry wood splitting under pressure that had been building and holding for a long time. The roots had been in that ground since the Hayes administration. They did not give without a fight. Ruth Ann watched for a few minutes. Then she went home and worked. She fixed the float valve on the cattle tank. She tightened wire on the south lot. She greased the hay rake even though it would not be needed for weeks. She came back to the kitchen at noon and wrote down the time the cutting had started. She came back at 3 and wrote how far it had progressed. She came back at dusk and walked the fence line with her tablet and her flashlight. She found what she expected it to find and was sorry to find. A flat, dark pool in the track left by the dozer tread. 8 inches across, cold when she pressed 2 fingers to it and rubbed them together slowly. The kind of cold that only comes from far below the surface. There had been no rain in 10 days. She wrote in her tablet April 13th. Water at North Root Hole. No rain. Cold seep. Hedge holding ground pressure until cut. Pressure releasing through exposed root channel. Same as Thomas described in 1927. Then she looked toward the harrow field where the brush piles were already smoking in the evening air, orange against the dark sky. And she looked back at the small, cold pool and she felt the particular kind of heaviness that comes not from surprise but from watching something you warned against happen exactly the way you said it would happen to people who chose not to hear you. She was not angry. She was tired in the way the land gets tired, in the way water gets tired, in the way anything gets tired that has been patient for a very long time and is still not done being patient. She walked back to the house, went to the kitchen, made supper, and ate it at the table next to the open notebook. The sound of the diesel engine was still faintly audible across the dark distance, doing what it had been paid to do. By the end of that first week, the whole county had heard that Grant Bellamy had begun clearing the Harrow place in earnest. At the Tuscumbia Diner on Main Street, men at the counter talked about it the way they talked about corn prices and interest rates, with the comfortable authority of people who were making decisions they did not have to live inside. Warren Boone, who ran cattle west of town, said it was about time somebody worked that ground properly. Dale Rusk, who sold seed and wore a pioneer cap even in August, said Bellamy's yield projections were optimistic, but the drainage plan was sound from what he heard. The banker Lyle Keller came in on Friday morning and said the development note looked strong. Someone mentioned that the Decker woman had warned against the clearing at the courthouse. A soft chuckle moved down the counter. Ruth Ann was not there for that conversation, but she heard about it from Darlene Voss, who ran the counter with the quiet, accurate attention of a woman who listened to everything and reported selectively, and who had been pouring Ruth Ann's Friday coffee since 1961. The following Friday, Ruth Ann came in as she always did. She sat at the far end of the counter and ordered her coffee and her slice of whatever pie Darlene had made that week. Apple that Friday with a crust that crumbled at the fork the way good crust does. She did not explain herself. She did not defend herself. She had found decades ago that explanation in a room like this to men like these cost more than it returned. What she knew. What the ground was doing, it would do. No amount of counter-seat amusement was going to change the physics of what happened when you blocked a 100-year-old pressure system in a river-bottom field above a clay seam connected to an underground spring. She ate her pie and paid and left Darlene a 50-cent tip, which was what she had always left, and which she did not adjust to make a point. Outside, Grant Bellamy's white company trucks were parked by the feed store 2 blocks down. The frame of the new machinery shed was already visible from the road rising on the low rise above the harrow field, pale and geometric against the April sky, looking like exactly what it was money deciding it knew better than the ground it was standing on. Ruth Ann looked at it for a moment. Then she got in the Ford and drove home. That same evening, a young man came to her door. He knocked twice quietly and stood back from the step with his hands in his pockets in the way of someone who is not sure of his welcome and has decided to make himself as small as possible in advance. He was 24 years old, lean, and uncertain in the way of young men who are still deciding what kind of man they want to be. He wore a canvas jacket and had mud on his boots from somewhere he had not intended to get mud. He said his name was Marcus Bellamy. He said he was sorry to bother her. He said his father did not know he was here. She looked at him for a moment through the screen door. She said, "Come in then." He sat at the kitchen table where Thomas's notebook still lay open under the lamp, and he told her he was studying agricultural land management at the University of Missouri in Columbia. He had driven out that afternoon after his last class because he had heard what she said at the courthouse from his father first, and then from 2 men in the college extension office who had also heard, and he had spent 3 days thinking about it, and he needed to understand something that was bothering him. He unrolled a topographic map he had brought, rolled under his arm. Modern survey data from the county GIS office and elevation contour lines from the State Geological Survey. He laid it on the table next to Thomas's notebook and was quiet for a moment looking at both. Then he put his finger on two places on the modern map where the contour lines converged in a pattern that indicated subsurface pressure movement. He said these two places on this map match the marks your grandfather made in that notebook. Ruth Ann looked at where he was pointing. She said, I know. He said they match within 20 feet. She said, I know that too. He looked up at her. He said, my father does not know I am here. She said, you told me that already. He looked back at the maps, both of them lying side by side on her kitchen table, the modern and the old one printed on survey paper, with county stamps and one written in pencil on brown paper by a man who had no access to county offices and no expectation that anyone there would receive him. He said, what do we do? She said, we wait, because that is what the ground requires right now. The ground is already telling us what is coming, but the time to act is not yet. He said, and if the storm comes before my father listens. She looked at him for a long moment, at the young face, at the canvas jacket with the university insignia on the sleeve, at the hands that had brought a map to an old woman's kitchen table because something he learned in a classroom had matched something written in 1927 by a man who never went to school past the third grade. She said, if the storm comes, I know what to open and where to open it, and I will need help. He said, I will come. She said, go home now, Marcus. Get some sleep. Tell your professors whatever you need to tell them about this visit, but do not tell your father. He stood and rolled the modern map back up. He left it on the table beside the notebook. She walked him to the door and watched his truck go down County Road 7 toward the highway, its taillights small in the April dark. Then she went back inside and sat at the table between the two maps, the old and the new, and poured the last of the evening's coffee and thought about what Thomas had written and what a young man in a university jacket had just confirmed with equipment that cost more than Thomas had earned in a decade. Some knowledge does not need to be taught. It needs to be noticed. Thomas had noticed. She had been trained to notice by the people who came before her. Now a young man whose father was cutting the hedge had noticed too. She opened her tablet. April 18th, 1984. Marcus Bellamy came, showed him Thomas's map beside county GIS data. He saw it. He understood what it meant. His father will not listen yet. The ground will say what needs saying when the time comes. We wait. She set the pencil down and looked out the window at the dark. The diesel engines had gone quiet across the fence. The hedge, or what was left of it, was invisible in the night. But she could feel its absence the way you feel the absence of a sound that has been present so long that silence registers as a physical change. She left the notebook open on the table under the lamp and went to bed. By the first week of May, the Harrow place no longer looked like abandoned ground. It looked like a project. There is a difference Ruth Ann had come to understand across many years of watching land change hands between land that is resting and land that is being acted upon, and the difference is audible if you live close enough to it. The machinery started before dawn most mornings. A laser leveler working the bottom acres, pulling the old undulation out of the soil and replacing it with clean, measured flatness. A drainage crew rolling out black corrugated tile in long coils across the smooth ground, burying it at engineered depths. The gravel road off County Road 18 had been widened and freshly topped, and a professional entrance sign had been installed at the corner. Bellamy River Bottom Project, high-yield corn development, no trespassing. The men at the diner admired the sign for 2 solid weeks. Ruth Ann noticed on her morning walks along the south fence of her own property that her side of the line was beginning to tell her things. Not dramatically, not in ways that would alarm a person who did not know what to look for. The grass in the lower corner of her south pasture was holding moisture in a pattern that had not been there in April. Her cattle, all 14 of them, had begun drifting away from the east fence line without being moved or directed, as though the ground itself had shifted in a way they preferred to avoid. Her oldest cow, a brindle named June that Harold had brought home as a calf 17 years ago, would not approach within 30 feet of the fence line that bordered the harrow ground. She stood with her head low and her ears forward facing the east boundary with the specific stillness of an animal that has detected something it does not like and has decided the safest response is distance. Ruth Ann knew what cattle knew. Cattle do not philosophize. They do not have theories. They do not read survey maps or consult county easement records. But they detect changes in ground pressure, in the subtle shift of moisture and temperature that precedes what the land is about to do, in the electromagnetic disturbance that moves through saturated clay before the surface gives any sign at all. They had been detecting these things since before people kept records, which meant their knowledge was older than any notebook and more reliable than most things measured by instruments alone. She documented everything. Her own tablet was filling with May entries. The tilt of Grant's new fence posts on the north line, first one at half an inch, then two more by the following Monday. A crack appearing in the freshly graded entrance road near the machinery shed running diagonal across the new gravel. Water pooling in a tire rut on the highest part of the field after 6 consecutive dry days, which meant it was coming from below and not draining. The smell of the air near the filled creek bed, which had been packed and smoothed and seeded until it looked like solid ground, but smelled on still mornings like a room that had been sealed too long. On May 9th, Grant Bellamy held what the county extension office had listed as an open field day. The extension agent came in a clean county truck. Lyle Keller arrived from the bank in pressed khakis and a good jacket. Dale Rusk brought seed brochures. 2 farmers from across the river came to watch the laser leveler demonstrate. Grant stood near the new entrance, talking slope and yield projection and drainage efficiency, in the particular confidence of a man who has organized a great deal of activity and needs the people watching to understand the scale of his competence. Ruth Ann had not planned to stop. She was driving home from the co-op with 2 rolls of baling twine and a bag of mineral salt when she saw the group of men near the field. She slowed. Not because of Grant, because of the ground. A pale, wet streak had appeared across the newly filled creek bed. Not wide, not deep, but it was there catching the afternoon light the way standing water catches light, and it had not been there the previous day, and there had been no precipitation in 11 days. Grant saw the Ford slow on the road and lifted a hand. She parked on the gravel shoulder and got out. He walked toward her with his field day smile, the one already built for an audience. He said, "Mrs. Decker, come and see what the future looks like." She looked past him at the smooth, flat field, at the wet streak across the filled creek bed, at the black drainage tile waiting in coils near the south section. She said, "What I see is a plugged creek." The laughter that followed was the careful kind, shaped to include Grant and exclude her. She had understood this particular form of social architecture since childhood, and it had stopped having the power to embarrass her sometime around 1965. The extension agent cleared his throat and said, "Subsurface moisture is not unusual in bottoms, Ruth Ann." She said, "Not on elevated ground after 11 consecutive dry days." Grant's jaw shifted. He stepped closer and his voice dropped into something more direct than the field day tone. He said, "Let me be straightforward with you. This is my land, my investment, and my risk. I have engineers who have reviewed this ground with proper equipment. I have a planting schedule the bank has signed off on. What I cannot afford is a recurring conversation about an old notebook and a dead creek every time you drive past my entrance." She looked at the men watching. Most of them found something to look at that was not her face. She said, "All right." She got back in the Ford and drove home. But that evening, she walked her south fence line with her tablet and her Polaroid camera, and she found what she had been expecting to find and did not want to find. Blue clay. Not much. 3 pieces the size of her thumb caught in the grass on her side of the line at the base of a shallow trickle of water that had no visible surface source. She picked one up and broke it open with both hands. Wet all the way through, cold as water from a deep well, which meant it had traveled up from far below the working depth of any soil test Grant's engineers had taken. She photographed the clay pieces in the grass. She photographed the trickle and its direction of flow. She photographed the fence line above it in the harrow ground beyond. Then she wrote May 9th. Blue clay on Decker South pasture below Bellamy North fence line. No surface water source. Temperature indicates deep seam origin. Bellamy drainage tile is cutting the clay layer. Water moving east under pressure. Clay carrying with it. Pattern consistent with Thomas's 1927 notation regarding blue clay at Mule Crossing. She sealed 3 of the photographs in an envelope with a typed letter explaining the drainage easement, the clay seam, and the risk to downstream properties, including Mabel Finch's farm, half a mile south. She addressed it to the senior engineer at the county office in Jefferson City by name. She mailed it the next morning. The envelope was returned to her 17 days later. Unopened, rewrote it to the wrong department, the postal stamp said. "Please resubmit to the correct office." She filed it in the cardboard box she kept beneath her bed, next to the copies of the drainage easement and the old survey maps, and the letters she had written over the years to offices that received them politely and acted on none of them. The box was not large, but it was full. She did not resubmit. Marcus came back twice that month. He came in the evenings, taking the long way around the Harrow entrance so his truck would not be visible from the field. He sat at the kitchen table and looked at the photographs and the clay samples she had dried and labeled and the new entries in her tablet, and he was mostly quiet in the way of someone who is absorbing something that is shifting the shape of what he thought he understood. On his second visit, he told her he had spoken with his father. He had been careful. He had framed it as an engineering question, something his land management coursework had trained him to flag. He mentioned the blue clay on the Decker property, the fence posts tilting, the wet streak across the filled creek on a dry day. He said it quietly, and he said it with the particular deference of a son trying to reach a father without alarming him. His father had listened for 90 seconds. Then his father had said, "Marcus, I appreciate you paying attention, but I have licensed engineers who have looked at this ground with equipment that costs more than most people in this county earn in a year. And what I do not need is my own son coming to me with Polaroid snapshots and an old woman's tablet to tell me I made a mistake." He had not been unkind about it, just final, the way he was final about things he had decided. Ruth Ann listened to all of it. Then she said he is not wrong to trust his engineers. Marcus looked at her across the table. She said they are competent people working with proper tools. They are not failing because they lack intelligence. They are failing because they are looking at the wrong layer of time. The instruments they brought can read the surface behavior of this ground very accurately. What they cannot measure is what this ground was doing before those instruments arrived, before the survey was taken, before the deed was signed. That is not an engineering failure. It is the natural limit of tools that have no memory. Marcus was quiet for a moment. Then he said, "So, what do we do?" She said, "I told you before. We wait. The ground is already building its argument. It does not need our help to make it. What it needs is for someone to be ready when the argument becomes impossible to ignore." He said, "And if the storm comes?" She turned the notebook to the page dated June 3rd, 1927. She ran her finger slowly under Thomas's description of the mule crossing. The limestone-lined channel, the cedar plug that Thomas had placed to control outlet flow, and that Thomas's son had maintained, and that Harold had maintained, and that she had checked every spring since Harold died. She said your people covered this spot when they filled the dead creek. They covered it with fill dirt and gravel, but they covered stone. Stone does not dissolve. It does not compact or shift. It is still there exactly where Thomas put it in 1871, and when we need to open it, I will know exactly where to drive the bar. Marcus looked at the notebook for a long time. He said my father called all of this folklore. She said your father has never had to write down what he knew because it was the only way to make sure it survived. Thomas could not walk into the county engineer's office and say, "Sir, I have been observing this drainage system for 25 years, and here is what I have found." They would not have received him. They would not have recorded his findings. They would have thanked him at the door and forgotten him before they sat back down. So he wrote it himself, in the only archive he controlled. This house, this drawer, this family. Marcus sat with that for a moment. Then he said quietly, "That is not just farming." She said, "No, it is not only farming. It is what people do when the official systems are not built to hold what they know. You build your own system. You make it as careful and as complete as you can, and you trust that someone will still be here to open the drawer when it matters." He left shortly after that. She walked him to the door as she always did and watched his truck go down the road. Then she came back to the table and sat with both maps for a long time. Thomas's pencil lines from 1869, the county elevation contours from 1984. Two documents separated by over a century, agreeing with each other in the quiet way that things agree when they are both describing something real. She opened her tablet. May 21st, 1984. Marcus came again. He understands what is at stake. He cannot reach his father. The fence posts on the Bellamy North line are tilting further. June will not go near the east fence at all now. The weather this week has been wrong in the way that precedes serious rain. Not yet, but soon. She added, Thomas wrote in 1943, through Harold's father's hand, warm rain after river rise open stones before midnight. If the north run is blocked, water will take the barn road. The north run is blocked. We are in the interval between the warning and the proof. She closed the tablet. The following Monday, she drove to First Western Agricultural Bank and asked for an appointment with Lyle Keller. She had prepared carefully. She had dressed in her good clothes, the ones she wore to church and to meetings where presentation was also evidence. She had typed 3 pages of observations from her tablet into a clean document on the typewriter Harold had bought in 1968. She had assembled the 1928 drainage easement, the return letter from the county engineer's office, the photographs, and the clay samples in a manila folder with a cover sheet that organized everything by date. Lyle received her in his office. He was polite. He was careful with his expressions in the way of a man who has learned to be careful around situations that could become complicated. She laid the 1928 easement on his desk first, then the photographs, then the typed observation pages. She said, "I am asking the bank to request an independent drainage assessment of the Bellamy property before he tiles the south section." Lyle adjusted his glasses and said, "Ruth Ann, the bank cannot instruct a borrower on his operational decisions based on concerns from a neighboring landowner." She said, "This is not only a concern, this is a county-recognized drainage easement that crosses the northwest corner of the Harrow property. It was recorded in 1928 and signed by the original landowners on both sides and the county judge. If Bellamy's tile working has obstructed the outlet for that easement, the bank has a potential liability exposure that its current risk assessment does not reflect." Lyle looked at the easement document. He looked at the photographs. He looked at the clay samples in their labeled bags. He said, "We will have our counsel review the easement." She said, "When?" He said, "When appropriate." She said, "The Memorial Day weekend forecast has a significant weather system in it. When appropriate could be several weeks too late for everything downstream of the Harrow field." He said, "Ruth Ann, I understand your concern. The drainage plan for this property was reviewed by licensed engineers. The bank has no independent basis to second-guess that review." She looked at him steadily. She said, "Harold used to tell me that a bank will loan a man an umbrella on a sunny day and want it back when it rains. I am asking you to keep the umbrella this time. Not for Bellamy, for the county road, for Mabel Finch's downstream lot, for the people who will have water in their lower fields when that ground fails." Something shifted slightly behind Lyle's careful expression. Not far, but it shifted. He said, "I will pass your concerns to our risk management office." She gathered her folder. At the door, she turned and said, "Lyle, I have held an account at this bank since Harold and I were first married in 1953. I have never been late on a payment, and I have never asked for a favor. I am asking now. One phone call to the county drainage office before the holiday weekend. That is all." He said he would see what he could do. She walked out through the glass doors into the May afternoon knowing he would not make the call. Not because he was a dishonest man, because he was a prudent man, and prudent men in positions like his had learned that acting on a warning before the thing it warned against had actually occurred was a kind of exposure that institutions preferred to avoid. After the disaster, they could say they had not known. Before it, acting on a warning meant accepting that the warning was credible, which meant accepting whose warning it was, which was a step that required a different kind of courage than Lyle Keller had been trained to exercise. She understood this. She had understood it her whole life. She drove home and checked the cattle. June and 2 of the younger cows had moved themselves without direction to the highest corner of the north pasture. The other 11 were ranged along the middle ground, none of them within 50 feet of the east fence. She looked at the sky. The horizon to the west held a yellow-purple color at its lowest edge that the old-timers in her family called floodlight. It was the color that sometimes preceded serious rain by 3 or 4 days. Not always, but enough times that Thomas had noted it specifically, and Harold's father after him, and Harold after that. She went to the barn and began loading the Ford. Shovel, axe, pry bar, coil of rope, chainsaw, fencing pliers, 2 feed sacks. The oilcloth-wrapped notebook, because wherever she went in the coming days, it was going with her. She covered the load with a canvas tarp and tied it at the corners. Then she went inside and made supper and sat at the table where Thomas's notebook lay open, watching the western sky through the kitchen window as the last of the afternoon light faded into something that felt less like evening and more like a held breath. She wrote May 26, 1984. Sky color concerning at western horizon. Ground holding moisture 2 inches above normal in lower pasture. Cattle at high corner without direction. Whatever is building to the west will arrive by the end of the week if the pattern holds. She added one final line for the day Thomas wrote in 1927. Water remembers its road, even when men forget it. The road is still there. The stone is still there. We are ready. She closed the tablet and went to bed. She did not sleep well, which was itself a kind of measurement she had learned to trust. The storm arrived at 7:14 in the evening of May 27th. The first hail struck the tin roof with a single sharp crack, then two more in quick succession, then a cascade that merged into a continuous percussion that filled the entire house with sound. Lightning came close behind it, close enough that the white flash and the thunder arrived almost together, one thing folded inside the other. Ruth Ann was already dressed. She had put on her canvas coat at 6:30 when the western sky turned the particular green-black that did not leave room for doubt. She had already moved the cattle to the high corner of the north pasture, working in the last hour of gray light, while the wind built from the west and the first gusts brought the smell of rain still miles away. She had positioned the loaded Ford in the drive facing the road. At 7 o'clock, she called Grant Bellamy's house. A young woman answered a voice she did not recognize, probably the daughter-in-law she had heard about but never met. Ruth Ann gave the message slowly and clearly. Tell him the ground is going tonight. Tell him to open the South Relief Run or move his crew off the low acres before 9 o'clock. Tell him Ruth Ann Decker called and that she gave her word at the courthouse she would warn him, and this is the warning. She did not know if the message would reach him in time or at all. She had given her word, so she gave it. At 9:30, Mabel Finch called. Her voice was shaking under the telephone static. She said, Ruth Ann, the water is into my lower lot. Ruth Ann said, how high? Mabel said, past the milk shed steps and still rising. Ruth Ann closed her eyes for one count of three. Mabel's lot sat half a mile downstream of the old Harrow Creek line. If water had already reached Mabel's milk shed steps, then Grant Bellamy's filled creek was not draining at all. It was holding the water like a bowl building pressure against the new tile and the packed, filled dirt, and when it went, it would go all at once. She said, I am going out, Mabel. Stay in the house and get to the second floor if the water comes inside. She hung up and drove. County Road 18 had brown water crossing it in sheets running off the saturated fields faster than the ditches could carry it. Twice the Ford slid sideways on gravel that had turned to grease beneath the rain, and twice Ruth Ann steered into the slide rather than against it the way Harold had made her practice in the church parking lot in winter, until the instinct was in her hands and not just in her head. At the Bellamy entrance, the professional sign had been knocked sideways by the wind. Beyond it, floodlights blazed near the machinery shed, and men were shouting in several directions at once. A tractor sat sunk to its axle near the filled creek bed, its rear wheels invisible in the gray muck that had appeared in ground packed solid a week ago. Two pickup trucks were parked too close to the low section, their tires buried past the rim. The new gravel entrance road had split lengthwise, water boiling up through the crack from below, rather than running across it from above. Grant Bellamy stood in the middle of it in a yellow raincoat, shouting at his field manager. His face in the floodlight had the look of a man who has just discovered that the limits of competence do not announce themselves in advance. Ruth Ann stepped out of the Ford with the notebook tucked under her coat. Grant turned and pointed at her. He said, this is private property. You need to leave. She looked past him at the field. The ground was moving, not in the violent explosive way of a dam break, in the way that ground moves when the pressure beneath it has been building for 6 weeks and the surface finally cannot hold it any longer. A slow, broad lifting and resettling like something enormous, breathing beneath the skin too tight to contain it. Then the skin broke. A section of the smooth, prepared corn ground 40 feet from where they stood split with a sound that was less like an explosion and more like a long exhale from something that had been holding its breath since April. Mud and water pushed up through the crack. One of Grant's hired men stumbled backward in the dark and went down on both hands. Grant said, what in God's name? Ruth Ann said the spring pocket opened. She said it without triumph, without any tone at all. The clay seam released. The water found the road your tile blocked. A shout came from the lower fence. 17 head of Grant's cattle had crowded against the wire on the south boundary, trapped between the rising water behind them and the new cut bank ahead where the dead creek had been filled and the ground now had nowhere solid to stand. A calf was bawling somewhere in the dark beyond the floodlights, the specific high sound of a young animal that has lost its footing in moving water. Sheriff Dobbs arrived at 10:06 with 2 volunteer firemen in a county truck. Behind them came Mabel's nephew in his pickup, and Marcus Bellamy, his canvas jacket soaked through his face white, and steady in the way of a young man who has driven 2 hours in deteriorating weather because he has been expecting this and has decided he will be here for it. He had not been called. He had come because he understood what the sky color meant. The sheriff climbed out and shouted over the rain, "We need to move this water." "Where is the outlet?" Grant pointed south. "He said there should be a ditch line at the south end." Ruth Ann shook her head. "She said that ditch cannot take what is coming up through this tile right now. It was never designed for this volume. The tile you laid blocked the primary outlet." Grant said, "How do you know that?" She reached inside her coat and pulled out the 1928 drainage easement, already wet from the rain, soaking through, and pressed it into Sheriff Dobbs's hands. "She said there is a relief run that crosses from here to the Deckerstone ditch on my property. County recorded in 1928. Signed by Thomas Decker, the Harrow family of that time, and the county judge. If we open it now, we'll pull this water east before it takes Mabel Finch's barn in the county road culvert." Grant stepped between her and the sheriff. He said, "You are not cutting across my field." Ruth Ann looked at him. "She said you bought the field. You did not buy the water. The water is following a road that was here before your deed and will be here after it." The sheriff unfolded the soaked easement in the floodlight and squinted at it. He looked at Grant. He said, "This is county recorded." Grant said it is 56 years old. The sheriff said, "So is the river." He handed the paper back to Ruth Ann. "Open it." She led them to the old mule crossing, to the place where it had been before Grant's crew graded 2 feet of fill dirt and fresh gravel over it 3 weeks ago. She stopped. She drove the pry bar into the mud once. Hard resistance, not compacted fill, stone. She went to her knees without hesitating and began pulling mud away with both hands. The rain was coming sideways now, cold and continuous. Her canvas coat was soaked through. Her hands were cold enough that she could no longer feel individual fingers, only the larger sensation of pressing and pulling. Marcus was beside her before she had cleared 6 inches. He had not been asked. He took the pry bar from her without a word and drove it deeper, working it in a circle to loosen the packed fill around the stone. One of the firemen came to her left side, Mabel's nephew on the right. 4 people digging in the dark in the rain, while the field behind them made sounds like a building settling toward collapse. Grant Bellamy stood outside the circle of light and watched. She registered him as a large, still presence in the yellow raincoat. Silent for the first time since April. Not directing, not planning, not explaining, just watching 4 people dig into the spot he had paid to erase. They uncovered flat limestone first, then packed blue clay beneath it, then old roots, then a rotted cedar board wedged deep in the stone channel mouth, waterlogged and dense and dark place there, at some point in the 1940s, to manage the outlet flow, and forgotten by everyone except the family that had put it there. Water pooled around their boots, but would not move. The channel was sealed too completely to open by hand. The cedar board was old and soft, but it was wedged too deep. Grant said from behind them, "It is not working." She did not answer. She took the pry bar from Marcus and drove it beneath the cedar board at its deepest point and put her weight on it. Her boots slid in the mud. Her right shoulder sent a sharp pain down into her elbow, the shoulder that had been giving her trouble since February. Marcus grabbed the bar just below her hands without being asked. She said again. He said together. They pushed. The board shifted a 1/4 inch, then stopped. She said again. They pushed harder. The board moved 1/2 inch. A sound came from beneath the ground. Not loud, not violent. A deep, wet exhalation like something enormous releasing a breath it had been holding for 40 years. The sound of pressure finding an opening. Everyone around the hole went still. Then the old relief ditch took its first drink in 4 decades. The water pooled around their boots, spun once twice, found a direction and began pulling hard toward the stone run. Not slowly, with intention. Mud and clay chips and dead leaves and pieces of old corrugated tile spiraled into the opening and were gone into the dark channel below. 30 yards away, the behavior of the broken ground changed. The boiling tile outlet slowed. The crack that had opened was still pouring water, but the direction of overflow shifted. The broad lifting motion in the field diminished. The water had found its road and was taking it. No one spoke. Not Grant. Not the banker Lyle Keller, who had arrived sometime in the last half hour, in his good leather shoes now standing at the edge of the floodlight, with his umbrella turned inside out by the wind, watching the spot where his institution's confidence had been placed. Not the extension agent who stood near the machinery, Shed repeating quietly this should not be happening, as though repetition might eventually make the ground agree. Ruth Ann stood up from the mud. She looked toward the trapped cattle at the south fence. She said, cut the lower fence. Move them to the rise before that cut bank gives way. This time Grant Bellamy did not argue with her. He ran for the fence pliers himself. She watched him go and said nothing about it. Marcus was beside Grant at the fence. The two volunteer firemen were on the cattle side with the flashlights. The fence was new, the posts swollen with rain, the wire tight and fighting the pliers. Grant worked the handles with both hands. He slipped once and went to one knee in the mud, cursed under his breath, found his footing, kept working. The calf was still audible somewhere in the dark beyond the floodlights, its sound high and thin and getting weaker. Ruth Ann pointed her flashlight toward the lower corner of the fence panel. She said, not that side. Open the second brace back from the corner. If you cut the low section, they will run straight into the break where the bank has already gone soft. Grant stopped. He looked at her in the floodlight and in the driving rain with mud on his knees, and his raincoat torn at the sleeve, and his face stripped of every layer of the man who had stood in the courthouse recorder's office 4 weeks ago. He moved to the second brace without a word. The wire snapped. Marcus and one fireman swung the cut panel wide. The cattle came through the gap the way frightened cattle always move, not in a line, not gracefully, but in a dark shoving mass of horns and shoulders and hot breath. One heifer hit the cut bank at the edge and went down on her front knees in the mud. Mabel's nephew grabbed her tail with both hands. Ruth Ann stepped in close enough to slap the animal's flank hard with her open palm. She said, up, come on now, up. The heifer lurched forward with a desperate surge. 3 feet behind her left hind leg, the cut bank gave way. A strip of ground 8 feet wide folded down into the water below, with a sound like heavy wet cloth being torn. The gap it left was black and deep and still filling. The heifer bolted for the rise, legs churning. Grant Bellamy stood at the fence and watched the ground where she had been standing. He did not move for a moment. His face was calculating something, and she knew what he was calculating because she had seen that expression before in other men who had just understood in the space of 3 seconds what would have happened if a decision had gone differently. If the fence had been cut from the other side, if she had not said anything. He did not say a word about it. Neither did she. By midnight, the old relief ditch was running full. It carried water east through the stone-lined throat that Thomas Decker had cleared with his own hands in 1871, past the walnut stump at the corner of Ruth Ann's pasture, through the natural swale, and into the county culvert on the safe side of the road. It was not a large channel. It could not swallow everything at once, but it changed the direction of the disaster. That was enough. Ruth Ann moved through the remaining hours of the storm with the economy of someone executing a plan prepared long in advance. Keep the trucks off the south section. Push the remaining calves to the rise through the west gap, not the east. Do not stand near the tile outlet. Abandon the machinery shed because the shed is already gone. The banker Lyle Kellen did not hear that last instruction quickly enough. He was standing near the machinery shed's concrete pad when the concrete told him what Ruth Ann had already said. The crack was quiet and almost polite. The north corner of the pad dropped 14 inches into the blue clay that had been waiting beneath the gravel pad since before the first concrete truck arrived. The new mower inside still had its dealer decal. At 2 in the morning, the rain eased from driving to steady. At 3, the river was still rising, but the worst of the underground pressure had found its outlet and was following the road it had always known. At first light in the gray May dawn that followed the kind of night that changes things, Ruth Ann stood at the edge of what the storm had written on the Bellamy field. The smooth, prepared corn ground was split by brown channels. The filled dead creek had reappeared not as a gentle scar, but as a raw wound laid open through the new work, running exactly and only exactly where Thomas Decker's 1927 pencil mark said it would run. 48 acres under standing water and silt. One center pivot tower leaning at a permanent angle. The gravel entrance road missing in 2 sections. The machinery shed sitting crooked and bowed, its sliding door jammed open by the shifted frame. Men stood in the gray morning without speaking. The same men who had laughed softly at the counter of the diner 6 weeks ago. The same men who had called the hedge brush in the notebook superstition and the warning the preoccupation of an old woman who did not understand modern agriculture. Mud has a way of taking the shine off certainty. Grant walked to where Ruth Ann stood near the stone run. His raincoat was torn at the sleeve and along one side seam. His boots were ruined past repair. There was dried mud along his jaw and a shallow cut across the back of his right hand that he had not stopped to clean. He said, "How did you know exactly where to open it?" She looked at the water still moving through the stone channel, clear now that the worst of the load had passed through. She said, "My grandfather opened it in 1871. His son opened it in 1943. My husband opened it in 1951. I kept it clear because they told me to keep it clear. Because they wrote down why it mattered and made sure someone was left who could read what they wrote." He said, "I thought it was just an old ditch." She said it was. That is why it mattered. Old things that have been doing their work for 100 years are not less valuable for being old. They are more valuable. They have already proved themselves against 100 years of what the land can do. He looked at the channel for a moment. Then he looked at her. He said, "I am sorry, Mrs. Decker." She said, "I know." And that was all she said, because what needed to be said had already been said in April at the courthouse, and in May at the fence line, and in the notebooks going back to 1869, and the ground itself had said the rest of it last night in language that did not require a response. 8 days after the storm, the county held its formal review in the basement of the Tuscumbia courthouse. Cinder block walls and metal folding chairs, and the particular fluorescent light of rooms where official things happen. Farmers came from both sides of the river. The county drainage engineer drove up from Jefferson City with measuring equipment and maps. The bank sent 2 representatives. The Extension Service sent the agent. The State Agricultural Office sent an observer. Grant Bellamy sat in the second row with his hands folded in his lap and his eyes lowered, not like a man waiting to defend himself, but like a man who has spent 8 days understanding something he cannot argue his way out of. The county engineer, a methodical young man named Raymond Cole, stood at the front of the room and arranged his documents and overlays on the presentation table with the careful efficiency of someone who has prepared for this carefully and intends to say exactly what the evidence requires and nothing more. Ruth Ann sat in the last row. When Raymond Cole finished his preliminary technical overview, she walked to the front of the room carrying Thomas Decker's notebook. She laid it on the table beside Raymond Cole's modern flood damage map. She did not speak immediately. She let the room see the 2 documents side by side. The modern survey paper with its county stamps and elevation contours and professional notations. The brown leather notebook with the cracked spine and the faded oilcloth wrapping held together by the care of several generations of people who understood what it was. Then she opened it to June 3rd, 1927, and read the entry aloud. The whole room heard Thomas's words for the first time. Words written by a man most of them knew nothing about in a house most of them had never entered, in a language plain enough that no one needed it explained to them. Water will always find the road it knew before men covered it. Raymond Cole stepped beside her. He placed a clear plastic overlay printed with the storm damage data from the previous week directly on top of the modern flood map. He said the marks in this document indicating the points he was referencing in Thomas's notebook correspond to the documented damage locations on the Bellamy property within a margin of 20 feet or less. He tapped one point on the overlay. He said this spring pocket location identified in the Decker family notebook in June of 1927 is the primary outlet that was blocked by the April and May 1984 grading operations. The soil survey conducted before those operations did not reach the depth at which the clay seam and spring outlet are present. That is why the survey did not identify the risk. The document that identified the risk is this notebook. He paused. He said, "In my professional judgment, the hydrological observations recorded in this document represent one of the most accurate informal assessments of subsurface drainage behavior in this river, bottom terrain available to the county. The drainage patterns described here are consistent with modern geophysical data in ways that indicate decades of careful, systematic, direct observation conducted at ground level over a very long period of time." The room was quiet. Ruth Ann stood beside the notebook with her hands folded and her back straight, the same posture she had held on the bench in the courthouse hallway 8 weeks ago when she waited for a sale to close that she could not stop, and a conversation she did not expect to have, and a warning she did not expect to be heard. Then Grant Bellamy stood. He turned to the room, not to the engineer, not to the bank representatives, to the room. He said, "I was warned." He said it without preamble, and without the careful construction that men who are accustomed to rooms like this use when they need to manage how they are perceived. He said, I was warned at the courthouse in April. I was warned at my fence line. I was warned at the field day in front of most of the people sitting in this room. I laughed. I called it stories. I called it old folklore. I filled a drainage channel that had been managing water in this county for over 100 years, and I replaced it with a tile system that my engineers designed without knowing what was underneath it because I did not give them the information that would have told them. He paused. He said I was wrong. In every particular, I was wrong. He looked at Ruth Ann. He said, I owe you more than an apology, but that is where I am starting. She looked back at him, not with warmth, not with coldness either, with the level, clear attention of a woman who has been waiting a long time for a room to be this quiet and is not going to let the moment be wasted on an easy response. She said, start with the hedge. He said, I beg your pardon. She said, you start by replanting the hedge. Osage, orange, cedar, wild plum. Staggered row along the old boundary where your crew cut it. I will tell you the spacing. I will tell you which species to anchor on which end. And then we open the relief run correctly and leave it open. He looked at her for a long moment. He said, all right. The county ordered the drainage easement formally restored and surveyed at county expense. The bank froze the second phase of Grant's development note pending an independent drainage review. His insurance covered some of the machinery loss, but not the grading error, and not the blocked drainage, and not the failed fill work. He sold one of the damaged pivots before it ever made a full rotation. He sold the disc ripper at a significant loss. The Great Bellamy River Bottom project became smaller, slower, more expensive, and more humble than it had been on the day the sign went up at the entrance. In July, they planted the new hedge. Not Grant's crew. Grant himself and Marcus beside him, and two men from the county conservation office who knew the planting patterns for this type of windbreak and hedgerow. Ruth Ann stood at the fence and directed them. She told them the spacing for each species. She told them why the cedar went on the west end and the Osage orange on the east. She told them which plants to set as anchors and which to interplant between. She told them not to expect anything to look like much for 3 years and not to expect the hedge to be worth anything for 7 years, and that this was the nature of things built to last rather than things built to impress. Grant listened. He wrote in a small spiral notebook he had bought at the hardware store in town. She did not comment on the notebook. She watched him write in it and did not say anything about what it meant to watch a man who had dismissed her grandfather's notebook as folklore standing in a muddy field writing in his own. Marcus worked beside his father through the July heat with the quiet attention of a young man who has understood something that will stay with him for a long time. He planted each seedling the way Ruth Ann directed at the depth she specified, with the spacing she indicated, asking questions when he was uncertain and accepting the answers without argument. At noon on the second day of planting, when the three of them sat in the shade of Ruth Ann's old walnut tree with cold water from her kitchen and the heat pressing down on the flat Missouri land around them, Marcus said, I want to learn this. Not just the drainage system, all of it, the observation method, the record keeping, the way you read what the ground is telling you before it has to say it loudly. Ruth Ann looked at him. She said, then come and learn it. Come on Saturdays through the fall. I will show you what Harold showed me, and what Harold's father showed Harold, and what Thomas showed all of them. He said, I would like that very much. She said, bring your notebooks, the modern ones and the old ones. You are going to need both. In October of that year, Ruth Ann invited the local FFA chapter to the Decker farm. 23 students in rubber boots and canvas jackets climbed off a yellow school bus with the half-attentive faces of young people who have been promised an educational field trip and are reserving judgment about what that will mean. She led them down the south road past the barn, through the young hedge line that was now 8 inches high on the Bellamy side and barely visible as anything other than a row of sticks across the drainage easement, and to the stone channel mouth where the relief ditch had opened on the night of the storm. She showed them the flood mark on her barn post that Harold's wife had penciled in 1951. She showed them the spring pocket and the clay seam. She showed them the relief run and explained where it went and why. Then she brought out Thomas Decker's notebook and let each of the 23 students hold it both hands the way you hold something that needs to be held with respect. She showed them Raymond Cole's overlay, the modern elevation data and the pencil lines from 1927 lying on top of each other, matching within 20 feet across a drainage basin that had not been officially surveyed until decades after Thomas made his marks. A girl in a red corduroy jacket raised her hand. She said, "Mrs. Decker, how did your grandfather know all of that without the modern equipment?" Ruth Ann looked at the girl for a moment. She said he knew because he watched. He watched for 30 years. He watched where the water went after every rain, where the cattle refused to stand, where the grass grew differently in dry summers, where the ground changed texture after a hard freeze. He watched because this land was the only security his family had, and understanding it completely was the only form of insurance available to him. He could not buy insurance from an office. He could not get a loan to cover losses. What he had was knowledge, and the only way to protect that knowledge was to write it down carefully enough that it could survive him. The girl wrote that down. Ruth Ann watched the pen move across the clean white page of the girl's notebook, watched young hands recording old words in a new book. Marcus Bellamy stood near the fence post at the edge of the group listening. He had a notebook in his hands too, his own, one he had started in May. Grant was not there. He had stayed at his own farm that morning, which she had expected and which she thought was the correct decision. There is a difference between a man who has admitted he was wrong and a man who shows up to observe the lesson about his wrongness, and Grant had understood that difference. It was the first sign that the change in him was real. After the bus left, Ruth Ann walked the fence line alone in the October afternoon. The young hedge on the Bellamy side was thin and unremarkable, a line of seedlings that would not look like anything useful for several years yet. But some of the Osage orange had already put out their first small branches, and the thorns, tiny and bright, were already exactly what they were going to be. On her side, the old walnut tree that Thomas had planted dropped a nut into the dry October grass at her feet. She bent and picked it up and held it in her palm for a moment. The weight of it, the specific hardness, the small, precise fact of it. The cattle were in the lower pasture moving slowly through the afternoon. June was near the east fence within 10 feet of it, which was as close as she had come since April. The ground had settled. The pressure was gone. The land had said what it needed to say and was quiet now. Ruth Ann put her hand on the fence post where the new wire met the old, at the point where the young hedge began. Harold used to say the land did not belong to the family. The family belonged to the land. He had said it the way he said the things he meant, completely, without decoration, without making it a speech, just putting the words in the air as a plain and sufficient fact. She stood there for a while with her hand on the post. Then she walked back to the house. The Ford was in the drive. Thomas's notebook was on the kitchen table under the yellow lamp where it had been since April, since the morning she had heard the diesel, and pulled on her canvas coat and driven to the fence line to say what she had come to say. She poured coffee and sat down at the table. She did not open the notebook. She knew every word of it. She knew Thomas's handwriting in every season, the careful, deliberate script of a man who had fought for each letter and treated the ability to form them as the serious and irreplaceable tool it was. She knew Harold's father's entries from the years when his hands shook. She knew Harold's own entries, one or two lines at a time, practical, and spare the language of a man who respected economy in everything. She pulled her own tablet toward her and picked up the pencil. October 14th, 1984. Hedge planted along Old Bellamy boundary both sides. FFA students came. 23 of them. Held Thomas's notebook. Raymond Cole's report is on file with the county now. The State Historical Society in Jefferson City has requested a copy. She set the pencil down. Outside, the walnut tree moved in a light wind. The lower pasture was still. The county road held its shape in the late afternoon light, the way it had held it after every storm she had known, all the way back to the ones she had watched from the front porch as a girl with her grandmother's hand on her shoulder. The land had been here before Thomas. It would be here after her. What she had was the interval between. The years she had been given to watch and record and hold what she knew carefully enough that it could be passed forward to whoever came next with enough patience and enough willingness to look at the right layer. Thomas had understood that. Harold had understood it. She understood it. Some land does not need a richer owner. It needs someone patient enough to have been here long enough to know what the ground knows and honest enough to write it down in a language the ground itself would recognize as accurate. She opened the notebook one more time, not to the 1927 page, to the first page, to where Thomas Decker had written his name in 1869 in the careful hand of a man who had just bought 40 acres with everything he had earned since the day freedom came and was writing his name in the front of a book because he intended to fill the rest of it with everything this land was going to teach him. Thomas Decker, Decker Farm, Miller County, Missouri. This land is ours, and we belong to it. She read it the way she had read it every year for 50 years. Then she closed the notebook and left it on the table under the lamp. Some books are not meant to be finished. They are meant to be continued. They are meant to be held in the hands of whoever comes next and opened to a blank page and continued in the same careful language with the same patient attention for as long as the land requires someone to keep the record. She left the lamp on. She left the notebook where anyone who came to that kitchen would see it before they saw anything else. Outside, the October evening settled over the Decker farm the way it had settled over it for 115 years. The walnut tree, the leaning barn, the new fence wire catching the last light, the thin young hedge on the far side of the boundary, not impressive yet, not what it was going to be, but alive and taking hold in the ground where it had always belonged. The stone channel ran quietly in the dark, doing what it had always done, carrying what the land gave it, going exactly where it had always gone, exactly as Thomas had written. It would exactly as the ground had always known.